Welcome, my political friends of the interwebs. Let me start this out by saying that if we cannot speak about race, we're screwed, literally. I'm going to pose a question that's going to be, it's going to be an honest question, but it's going to be a kind of a divisive question, possibly controversial. We'll see, but I think it's an important question to ask. So it is what it is. All right, here's the thing. I couldn't help but to fixate or dwell on the Supreme Court deciding that Obamacare was constitutional and therefore the law of the land. I could not help but to just obsess about it because I couldn't for the life of me figure out how it was even possible that this is now the law of the land. And before anybody gives me flack on that, listen, nobody from the left even thought that this thing would pass constitutional muster because it was clearly unconstitutional. And when you've got the only thing that gave us any insight from the Chief Justice was his attitude of, look, it's not my place or it's not the court's place to protect you from your political decisions, which basically said, look, you voted for the guy. You voted for the guy. Joe the plumber told you he was all about, socialism. What did you think was going to happen? So what? Now you want us to save you from Obama? No, we're not doing it. Which was a crock of shit because they should have been saving us from Obama. So the question became, why then didn't they? What was it about 5 Supreme Court justices that took something that was so clearly unconstitutional and made it law of the land? I mean, how does this happen? So the only theory that I could come up with, was a racial theory. And I want you to hear me out on this. And I'm not saying that this is the way it was. I'm just saying that this is a possibility, and I would be very curious to get some feedback. So if you could, in the comment section, give me some feedback. Here's the thought. And I tried to envision myself as a fly on the wall in the Supreme Court chambers where they were deliberating this whole abomination. And I envisioned one of the liberals on the court saying, look, this is the first black African American president, Freudian slip, in the history of the United States. All the polls are indicating that he's going down hard. He's now officially the quote-unquote underdog, which, by the way, when the left-wing media is willing to say that he's not doing well and he's the underdog to Mitt Romney, you knew it was pretty bad. Because in fact, the first media outlet that I even heard call him an underdog was MSNBC. And that had to kill them. So here they are in the Supreme Court, and they're saying to themselves, they're talking amongst each other and saying, look, we're talking about the first African-American president in the history of the United States, and he's going to be an absolute disaster. We can't let this happen. We cannot let this happen. He's not likely to get reelected, and the only thing that he has going for him is saying, hey, I got this forever altering piece of legislation through that nobody else had been able to accomplish, and that's it. That's just one feather in his cap. So the Supreme Court's thinking to themselves, look, he's not going to get reelected, so at least let him have this. I mean, because he was Obama was going down hard in flames, and everybody was saying it. And bottom line, the only thing that any historian could have looked back at and said that was a major accomplishment was the whole Obamacare thing. So if you take the Obamacare thing away from him, he becomes 1,000 times worse than Jimmy Carter, which, unbelievable. How crazy is that? But true. Hell, even Jimmy Carter was piling on, turning the screws, I mean, and I don't blame him because, I'm sure Jimmy Carter's sick and tired of being considered the worst president. And as much as people said anything about George Bush, the fact of the matter is, everybody pretty much still agreed that Jimmy Carter was the worst president of all time. So, I don't know. I mean, so I envision the Supreme Court deliberating this and making an argument that, look, let's give them this. Because if we don't at least give them this, there's nothing that historians can look back at and say, anything positive about. Okay, so, I mean, now I can only imagine Clarence Thomas was puking a little bit, in his mouth there, getting a little sick. No, it's just hearing that. Clarence Thomas, by the way, in my opinion, probably the finest Supreme Court justice that we have. Thank God we did not allow the nonsense from the left to derail him becoming a Supreme Court justice. If you remember that whole Anita Hill crock of shit, where she claimed that he had sexually harassed her the whole time she went from job to job, just followed him from job to job to job, and then when she knew she was going to be out of a job, she had to make some sensation out of it. I guess she just put out another book recently, whatever, hopefully nobody buys it. So anyway, to get back on topic here, I don't know, I mean, that's the question. Do you think this was a racially motivated decision by the Supreme Court? Because I think it's possible. Because when you search for an answer as to how this was, how this decision came down, how it was possible to turn something so clearly unconstitutional on its head, you have to explore every possibility, and I don't think anybody has mentioned the race possibility yet, and I don't say this to be racial. I just say this as, hey, look, we need to debate this. We need to figure out exactly why the Supreme Court came up with this decision. And I think all things should be put on the table. Nothing should be left off. And so race is one of those things that should not be left off, because I think there's a logical argument to be made that they were trying to protect the legacy of the first African American president. And maybe Chief Justice Roberts was thinking to himself, well, look, I'm going to call this thing a tax. They can repeal this thing, okay? But where that becomes dangerous, okay, is that I think we all know, in fact, you're hearing a lot about this now in the media, that once you lent the genie out of the bottle, it's very difficult to get it back in. It would be like trying to repeal Medicare or repeal Social Security. It's just certain things just don't happen. It's going to be, unless the Republicans come out with a pretty good alternative that includes things like pre-existing conditions, it's going to be real difficult to get this thing overturned. I mean, it's going to become a political football, and I think the left benefits from that for generations, as they do with every social program. Okay, so the Supreme Court, by being racial, literally has turned things upside down and has done, in my opinion, more harm than good. Because clearly this was an unconstitutional law. I don't know that there's any other way to look at it. And like I said, even the liberals weren't seeing this as something that wasn't going to get shot down by the Supreme Court. And they were prepared for it. They were loading up ammo to call the Supreme Court a bunch of right-wing nuts. Even though they knew damn well that it wasn't constitutional. So I don't know. What do you think? Let me know what you think in the comment section. Do you think it's possible that the Supreme Court of the United States of America was doing nothing more than trying to protect the legacy of the first African American president in the United States history? Do you think that's a possibility? So anyway, let me know what you think. I don't, there's no sense in dragging us on any longer than that, but I think that's a legitimate question. And by the way, if you don't think that it's a legitimate question, let me know in the comment section. Because I'd be curious to know. By the way, if you tell me in the comment section that you don't believe that this is a legitimate question, and if you don't believe that this is something that should be thrown into the debate, I'd like you to tell me why. And by the way, the answer to that question isn't just you're a racist, because that's not the answer to the question. I am not a racist. Nobody can ever confuse me of being a racist. But I do think that this is an important question and should be asked. Now, having said that, if that be, we'll never know. Okay, nobody in the Supreme Court, even the conservatives, are ever going to admit that was even part of the discussion. Okay, but let's just say that there was a deep throat in the group. Let's just say that, and that actually came out that was a mitigating factor for the Supreme Court, race. Okay, and that this was a racial decision. If that actually came out, do we impeach certain justices? I think that would be an interesting question. And by the way, does anybody know the actual procedure to impeach a Supreme Court justice? It's funny because I'd always thought that they were on the bench for life, but then somebody did say that they can be impeached. I have no idea what the process is on that. If anybody's got a link where I can read up on it, I would appreciate it. Or if you want to make a video attachment and explain to me how you can impeach Supreme Court justices, yeah, because to me, that could be an interesting little avenue to go. Because if they did this for racial reasons, I think there should be impeachments. I really do. So, all right, that's all I got for you. Everybody take care. Have a good day. See ya.